London is wrapped in fog, and where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back in the game. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones and unravel new mysteries alongside him. London, in the soft gloom of an October evening, lay muffled beneath a mist that curled like breath around the lamps of Baker Street. The rain had ceased an hour before, but the air was thick with its memory, and the cobblestones gleamed as if freshly polished. Inside my consulting room at 2T1B, a cheerful fire burned low, casting long amber reflections upon the walls. I had closed my medical practice early that day. The absence of my old companion, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, had made the place seem intolerably still. It had been 6 months since the tragedy at the Reichenbach Falls, and though I had striven to occupy myself with work, the loss had left an emptiness no patient could fill. I had just set down my pen after finishing a letter to a friend when a soft knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson's step followed, brisk but cautious. "A gentleman to see you, Dr. Watson," she announced, her voice low. "He says it is a matter of urgency." "Show him in," I said, curious. Patients arriving so late often brought strange tales, and my practice, though modest, had accustomed me to the unexpected. The man who entered was of medium height, wrapped in a dark travelling coat still damp from the rain. His hat shadowed a face that might once have been handsome, but was now drawn and weary, with a nervous twitch about the eyes. He removed his gloves slowly, as though each movement were an effort of will. "You are Dr. John Watson?" he asked in a hoarse whisper. "I am. Please, take a seat." He sat stiffly, glancing toward the window as if expecting to see some phantom lurking in the fog. "Forgive my intrusion, Doctor," he began, "but I scarcely know where else to turn. I am a very sick man." I gestured toward the light. "What seems to be the trouble?" He hesitated, then spoke with a trembling lip. "My name is Charles Forsyth. I am lately returned from India. For several weeks I have been haunted. Haunted, sir, by something that will not let me rest." "Haunted," I repeated gently. "You speak of nightmares, perhaps?" He shook his head. "Not dreams. It comes in my waking hours. I see a face, always the same face. A man's face, dark, accusing. He was killed years ago, Doctor, but he comes again. He follows me through the streets, in my sleep, even in the glass of a mirror." I leaned forward, studying him more closely. His pulse was rapid, his pupils dilated. There was something more than fever in his expression. It was terror. "Tell me," I said quietly, "what is the history of this man you say you killed?" Forsyth gripped the arms of his chair. "It was in the Punjab 10 years ago. A quarrel between officers, foolish, heated words. I struck him. He fell, and when I left the tent, he was dead. They said it was an accident, but I have known no peace since. For years I buried the memory, but lately—" He stopped, looking wildly toward the window. "Lately, he has returned. I see him in every shadow." I felt a pang of sympathy, mingled with a doctor's curiosity. "You believe this vision to be supernatural?" His lips twisted in a bitter smile. "I no longer know what to believe. I came to you, Dr. Watson, because you are known not only as a physician, but as a man who once stood beside how shall I say, a master of reason, the great Sherlock Holmes. At the sound of that name, my heart gave a painful throb. I cleared my throat. "Mr. Holmes is no longer with us," I said gravely. "Yes," Forsyth murmured, lowering his eyes. "I read of his death. Forgive me." For a moment, we were both silent, the crackle of the fire filling the room. Then I said, "You must rest, Mr. Forsyth. I can recommend treatment, perhaps a few days of quiet here in London. I shall watch your progress myself." He looked up with a flicker of gratitude. "You are kind, Doctor, but—" He hesitated. "There is one thing more. I cannot remain long in one place. I am being followed. I feel it." "Followed? By whom?" "I cannot say. Sometimes I think it is the dead man himself. Other times, someone who knows." I assured him that fear and exhaustion could create such impressions, but I noted carefully every word. When he had gone, promising to return the next day for further examination, I found myself staring into the fire long after midnight, his pale face lingering in my mind. There was something in his story, some echo of deceit or danger, that stirred old instincts long dormant since Holmes's passing. The following morning brought a dense fog and a restless mood. Forsyth kept his appointment, and I examined him thoroughly. Physically, he was sound, but his hands trembled, and when I asked about his past, he grew evasive. He wore a curious ring upon his right hand, gold, with a crest unfamiliar to me. When I inquired about it, he slipped it off hastily and pocketed it, muttering that it was a relic of India. That evening, he failed to return to his lodgings. The innkeeper sent word to me. Mr. Forsyth had left after dusk, saying he was going to walk by the river. He did not come back. I hurried to his room at once. The bed was untouched, his trunk half-packed. On the desk lay a single glove, stained darkly with what could only be blood, and a folded note addressed to me. My hand trembled as I broke the seal. It read, "He has found me again. Forgive me, Doctor, it is too late." The words struck me like a chill wind. For the first time in months, I felt the old thrill of peril, the sharp edge of a mystery unfolding. And beneath it all, one thought rose above the rest. If only Holmes were here. The note lay before me on the desk, the ink scarcely dry, the blood-stained glove beside it like a mute witness to some dreadful event. The gaslight flickered upon the words, and as I read them again, a sense of cold foreboding crept upon me. He has found me again. Who was he? A man from the past, a living pursuer, or the spectre of the one Forsyth claimed to have killed? I locked the note and glove within my desk drawer and resolved to take immediate action. Years of companionship with Sherlock Holmes had taught me that every hour's delay might mean the loss of vital clues. Though my old friend was gone, his methods remained indelibly printed upon my mind. I began with the innkeeper, a decent fellow named Barnes, who met me at the door of Forsyth's lodgings in Fleet Street. "I can't make sense of it, Doctor," said Barnes, rubbing his hands together. He seemed nervous all day, pacing the floor and peering out the window. Then, just before dusk, he puts on his coat and says he's going for a short walk along the embankment. I offered to send one of the lads with him. London's no place for a gentleman alone at night. But he laughed it off. Never saw him again. "Did he speak to anyone before leaving?" Barnes frowned. "Now that you mention it, a letter came for him about noon. I don't know the hand. Looked foreign to me. He read it right here in the hall, went pale as death, and tore it into pieces. I swept them up, but some may still be in the bin." That was something. I asked to see the refuse basket and carefully sifted through the scraps under the lamplight. A few fragments of paper remained legible. One bore a printed address, Marston Lodge, Kent. Another, in fine cursive, read simply, "You cannot hide from the truth forever." I pocketed the scraps. Did he leave any luggage? Only his trunk. It's locked. With Barnes's permission, I forced the small lock. Inside lay a few personal effects, a shaving kit, some Indian trinkets, and several old letters bundled together with a faded ribbon. The topmost bore the stamp of the British Army and was addressed to Major Arthur Selby, Bengal Lancers. Selby. The name was unfamiliar to me, but not, I suspected, to the man who had called himself Charles Forsyth. There was also a faded photograph of two young officers in uniform, standing before a whitewashed barracks. One of them was unmistakably Forsyth, or rather Selby, and the other a darker man with intense eyes and a strong jaw. On the back was written in a delicate hand, "To Arthur, from your friend Charles Lahore, 1883. The blood on the glove, the message, the false name, it all hinted at a mystery more earthly than supernatural. I could almost hear Holmes's voice in my mind. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I returned home with the trunk's contents, my thoughts in turmoil. The photograph and letters suggested that Forsyth and Selby were two distinct men, comrades once, perhaps enemies later. Could it be that the man in my consulting room had assumed his friend's identity after the quarrel in India? The question gnawed at me. Sleep was impossible. I sat late into the night before the fire, examining each clue again, when a sharp knock startled me. It was near 2 a.m. Mrs. Hudson had long retired, so I went myself to the door. A tall, spare figure stood in the hallway, the lamplight glinting on a familiar hawk-like profile. My heart leapt. "Good heavens!" I cried. "Holmes!" He raised a finger to his lips. "Hush, my dear Watson. Not so loud. I am not supposed to exist, you understand." For a moment, I could only grasp his hand in silent astonishment. The keen grey eyes, the sardonic smile, the aquiline nose. It was indeed my friend, leaner and paler than I remembered, but very much alive. "I see you are still capable of amazement," he said, stepping lightly into the sitting room. "I took the liberty of letting myself in by the back door. My reappearance in London is, as yet, unofficial." "When? How?" I stammered. "I thought you dead." "A misconception I encouraged," he replied, seating himself and drawing out his old briar pipe. "The fall at Reichenbach was survivable, though scarcely comfortable. But I could not reappear until certain matters concerning Professor Moriarty's organization were concluded. I came tonight because I read of your patient in the evening paper." "The paper?" I repeated. Holmes handed me a folded sheet of the Globe. There, among the local items, was a brief notice. "Strange disappearance in Fleet Street. A gentleman giving his name as Charles Forsyth, lately returned from India, has vanished from his lodgings under mysterious circumstances." A blood-stained glove and a note addressed to Dr. John Watson were found in his room. "The police have been informed." "You see, Watson," Holmes said quietly, "your adventures have not gone unnoticed. Naturally, I took an interest." I told him everything: the patient's visit, the story of the haunting, the disappearance, and the discovery of the name Arthur Selby. Holmes listened intently, his eyes half closed, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. When I finished, he nodded slowly. The elements are promising. A false identity, an Indian connection, and a letter from Kent. Your instincts served you well to keep the clues. You think the man was not Forsyth? On the contrary, I think he was not even sure himself who he wished to be. But we shall know soon enough. Watson, pack your revolver. We leave for Kent on the morning train. Marston Lodge? I asked. Precisely. The following day dawned bleak and grey, the mist clinging to the river like a shroud. We took the 8 o'clock express to Kent, and as the countryside rolled by, Holmes remained silent, gazing out of the window. I could see that his mind was already far ahead, tracing invisible threads between the clues. At Ashford Station, a small dog cart awaited us, driven by a rustic lad who eyed Holmes with curiosity. "You'll be for Marston Lodge, sir?" he asked. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "A fine house, I hear." "Aye," said the boy. "Belongs to a Mr. Charles Forsyth. Been there nigh on 10 years. Quiet gentleman, mostly keeps to himself." Holmes shot me a quick glance. "Ah, so there is a Charles Forsyth living there?" The lad nodded. "Yes, sir. Been ill of late, folks say. Doesn't see many visitors." Holmes settled back in the seat, his expression unreadable. "Very interesting, Watson. Very interesting indeed." As the cart rattled along the winding country lanes, a chill wind swept over the fields. In the distance, among dark yews and climbing ivy, I saw the outline of a large, old-fashioned house, its tall chimneys silhouetted against a leaden sky. Marston Lodge awaited us, and within its walls, I felt sure, lay the key to the mystery of the man who called himself Forsyth. Marston Lodge stood upon a gentle rise above the marshes, its tall windows gazing sullenly across the sodden fields. A house of old red brick, it bore the melancholy air of an estate long fallen from prosperity. As we approached along the gravel drive, I observed curtains drawn in most of the windows and a faint wisp of smoke issuing from one chimney only. Holmes regarded the building with a critical eye. "A lonely dwelling, Watson," he murmured. "It invites secrets as naturally as London invites fog." We were received at the door by a gaunt housekeeper in black bombazine who looked at us with startled suspicion. "Mr. Forsyth is not receiving visitors," she said curtly. "He has been ill." Holmes smiled pleasantly. "Be so good as to inform your master that an old acquaintance has come from London on a matter of private importance." The woman hesitated, visibly uncertain. "And the name, sir?" "Tell him that Mr. Sherlock Holmes waits upon him." Her eyes widened, but she withdrew without a word. We stood in the cold hall, the scent of disuse heavy in the air, until footsteps returned, and she motioned us to follow. We were led into a drawing room whose faded curtains and dim light lent it the aspect of a forgotten tomb. At the hearth stood a man, tall, lean, with a face pale as parchment. His hair, though thick, was streaked with grey, and his eyes gleamed feverishly under dark brows. He leaned upon a cane, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Holmes," he said in a low voice that trembled on the edge of hostility. "I did not expect this visit. To what do I owe the honour?" Holmes inclined his head. "To a name, sir, your own. You are Mr. Charles Forsyth of Marston Lodge." "I am." "And you have lately returned from India." His expression did not change, though his fingers tightened upon the cane. "That is correct. May I ask what concern this is of yours?" Holmes took a seat uninvited, crossing one leg over the other with deliberate ease. A man calling himself Charles Forsyth has vanished from London, leaving behind a blood-stained glove and a note addressed to my friend Dr. Watson. The coincidence of name and origin struck us as worthy of inquiry. The colour drained from Forsyth's face. He sank heavily into a chair opposite. "Then you know?" "That depends on what there is to know," said Holmes. "Perhaps you will enlighten us." For a long moment, Forsyth stared into the fire, the shadows leaping across his strained features. "It is a long story," he said at last, "and one I would have given much to forget. The man who came to you, Doctor, was not mad. He was hunted by his own past." Holmes leaned forward, his keen eyes fixed upon the speaker. "Then he was not you?" "No," Forsyth whispered. "He was Major Arthur Selby." The revelation confirmed what we had already suspected, yet it opened the door to questions more tangled than before. "Major Selby," Holmes repeated softly. "Of the Bengal Lancers." "I see." Forsyth gave a weary nod. "Yes, we served together in India. We were friends once, or thought we were, until ambition and pride drove a wedge between us. There was a scandal, funds missing from the regimental accounts, a duel that should never have been fought. Selby accused me of betrayal. One night, after too much drink, there was a struggle in his tent. He fell, struck his head upon the corner of a trunk. He was dead. Watson, ever the soldier, interrupted gravely. "You reported the accident, of course?" Forsyth gave a mirthless laugh. "I panicked, I fled, I deserted. And when the regiment learned of Selby's death, they assumed I too had perished. I took his name, Selby's name, and fled to England under it. For 10 years I have lived as Charles Forsyth. The irony does not escape me." Holmes sat back, silent, his fingertips pressed together. "Then the man who came to Watson was indeed the ghost from your past, alive, not dead." Forsyth looked up sharply. "Alive? Impossible. I saw him lifeless with my own eyes." "Nevertheless," said Holmes, "he stood in Watson's consulting room less than a week ago. He spoke of a haunting, of being pursued by one he had killed. But if Selby was your victim, and he still lives, then whom did he kill?" Forsyth's lips moved soundlessly. "Good God," he whispered. "You mean there was another?" Holmes rose suddenly and began to pace. "There is something here that does not accord. 2 men, each calling himself the other, both pursued by guilt, and now one missing. It is a fine tangle, Watson." I could not help but agree. Forsyth passed a shaking hand across his brow. "If Selby is alive, he will come for me. I know the man's pride, his temper. He will not rest until the truth is known." Holmes halted before him. "Then we must be ready. Tell me, who else in England knows of your connection with the regiment?" "No one. I have lived in isolation since my return. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lyle, has been with me only 2 years." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Very well. You will remain indoors tonight with the windows locked. Watson and I will take rooms at the inn in the village. Should anything occur, any sound, any visitor, send word instantly." Forsyth agreed, though fear clouded his face. As we took our leave, I glanced back once at the lonely figure by the fire. His was the countenance of a man haunted less by phantoms than by memory itself. Outside, the wind had risen, moaning through the hedges. We had not gone 50 yards down the drive when Holmes stopped abruptly. "Do you see that light, Watson?" he asked, pointing toward us upper floor of the house. A pale flicker danced across one window, moving swiftly from left to right. It vanished as suddenly as it appeared. "A lantern," I said. "Or a signal," Holmes murmured. "Come, let us not be seen." We took shelter behind a yew hedge and watched. After several minutes, the light reappeared, this time lower, in what must have been the library window. Then the front door opened, and a dark figure stepped out into the rain. "Forsyth," I whispered. Holmes shook his head. "No, too tall, and walking without a cane." The man moved quickly down the path, disappearing through a side gate that led toward the woods. Holmes waited until the sound of footsteps faded, then straightened. "Our visit, my dear Watson, has already borne fruit. Someone else takes a keen interest in Marston Lodge tonight." We followed in silence, keeping to the shadows. The stranger's trail led across the fields to a narrow lane, then to the old churchyard that bordered the estate. There, beneath the ancient yews, we found him. He knelt beside a fresh mound of earth, a lantern beside him, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Holmes motioned me to stay back and crept closer, noiseless as a cat. Suddenly, the figure looked up, startled by some instinct. The lantern's light fell across his features, and I caught my breath. It was the face of Forsyth. For one fleeting instant, I thought the man from the house had followed us. But no, the eyes were different, the hair darker, the posture more assured. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he snuffed the light and vanished into the night. Holmes returned to me, his expression grim. "Watson," he said quietly, "we are not dealing with one man of many names, but two men who have worn the same name. And one of them, I fear, is a murderer still." The church bell tolled midnight, echoing across the marshes. Somewhere in the darkness, a lonely owl hooted. I felt the chill of the grave settle upon my heart, for I knew then that the game had begun in earnest. The following morning broke grey and raw, a pale mist hanging low over the fields like a shroud. Holmes and I breakfasted in silence at the small inn in the village of Marston. The events of the previous night, our encounter with the mysterious figure at the churchyard, had left my mind uneasy. Holmes, however, seemed invigorated, his keen eyes glinting with that peculiar brightness that always foretold his complete absorption in a case. When at last he pushed aside his untasted coffee and rose from the table, I knew that some plan had already taken root in that remarkable brain. "Watson," said he, drawing on his gloves, "I purpose to pay another visit to Marston Lodge, but not by the front door. You will oblige me by calling upon Mr. Forsyth openly in your own name. Engage him in conversation, distract him if you can, while I make a quiet inspection of the grounds." "Then you suspect Forsyth himself?" I asked. "I suspect only that he has not told us all he knows," he answered dryly. "The truth, my dear fellow, is a patient adversary. It waits for us to uncover it." Within the hour, we were again on the muddy lane that led to the house. I left Holmes at a turn in the hedge and continued alone up the drive. The housekeeper received me with her usual grim courtesy and ushered me into the same sombre drawing room. Mr. Forsyth sat by the fire, his cane beside him, his face pale and drawn from a sleepless night. "Ah, Dr. Watson," he said, with a faint attempt at composure. "You bring news?" "None yet," I replied, "but Mr. Holmes requested that I see how you fared." He gave a bitter smile. "Holmes, he is a man who never forgets, is he not?" I confess I scarcely slept. The storm, the wind, every creak of the house seemed a footstep. He motioned me to a chair, and for a time we spoke of indifferent matters. But I noted that his gaze wandered often toward the windows, and more than once he started violently at some distant sound. I judged that the strain of suspense was telling upon his nerves. Meanwhile, somewhere outside, Holmes was at work. It was nearly noon when he appeared suddenly at the window, tapping softly upon the glass. I excused myself and stepped out into the corridor. Holmes beckoned me to follow him to the side of the house, where we could speak unobserved. "Well?" I asked in a low voice. He drew from his pocket a small object wrapped in paper. "A curious find, Watson, beneath the lilac bushes near the south wall. A revolver of foreign make, recently discharged. The smell of powder still clings to it." I stared at it in astonishment. "Then violence has already been done here." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Or perhaps violence is only promised. I have also discovered footprints, 2 sets, leading from the garden to the churchyard gate. One belongs to Forsyth, the other is heavier, the heel worn down. We saw those same prints last night." "Then the man who called himself Selby returned to the house." "It would appear so, and he was armed." Before I could reply, a cry rang out from the house. A woman's cry, shrill with terror. We ran at once to the front door. Mrs. Lyle, the housekeeper, met us upon the threshold, her face ashen. "It's Mr. Forsyth, sir," she gasped. "He's gone." We hurried to the drawing room. The chair by the fire was empty, the cane lying where it had fallen. The door that opened onto the terrace stood wide, and beyond it the gravel showed fresh footprints leading toward the woods. Holmes bent down, examining them with a practiced eye. He left in haste, alone and unarmed. "Watson, fetch my coat. We must follow at once." We took the path through the trees, the damp branches brushing our faces. The trail was plain enough at first, then lost itself among the undergrowth near the edge of the marsh. Presently, we came upon a clearing where the ground was churned with footprints and broken reeds. Holmes knelt, studying the scene with intense concentration. "There were 2 men here," he said at last. "One waited behind that oak, the other approached from the path. There was a struggle. See, the prints overlap, and here, a splash of blood upon the grass." I followed his gaze and saw a crimson stain dark against the green. My heart sunk. Then Selby found him. "Perhaps," said Holmes, "or perhaps Forsyth found Selby. Look, drag marks leading toward the water." We followed them to the very edge of the marsh, where the black water lapped sluggishly against the reeds. Something glimmered there beneath the surface. With my stick, I drew it closer. It was a gold ring, engraved with the same curious crest I had seen upon Forsyth's hand when he first visited me. Holmes took it between his fingers. "A fitting symbol, Watson. The circle closes." At that moment, a voice called from behind us. It was a farm labourer, a stout fellow in corduroy, running toward us with evident excitement. "Begging your pardon, gents," he cried, "but there's a man lying yonder by the old mill. Hurt bad. Looks like he's been shot." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Show us at once." The man led us through a tangle of briars to a ruined mill by the stream. There, half hidden among the weeds, lay the figure of a man. He was alive, though barely conscious. As we knelt beside him, I saw that it was not Forsyth, but Selby, the very man who had vanished from London. He opened his eyes and looked up at us with a faint smile. "Too late, Doctor," he whispered. He struck first. The truth. Tell the truth. His voice failed and he fell back, insensible. Holmes examined the wound with quick precision. A pistol shot through the shoulder spent its force against the bone. He will live if we act swiftly. Between us, we carried him to the road, where a passing cart took us back to the inn. There, I dressed his wound and had him placed in a quiet room. For hours, he lay in fevered delirium, muttering fragments of his strange story, words like India, ledger, and revenge. When at last he slept, Holmes drew me aside. You see, Watson, how the picture sharpens. We have Selby alive, wounded by Forsyth, or by someone who meant him to think so. But Forsyth himself has vanished into the marsh. Until we find him, the case stands incomplete. He turned to the window, where the last light of day was fading over the meadows. There is something rotten beneath this business of exchanged names. I have sent a telegram to London, to Mycroft, requesting information from the War Office concerning both men. By tomorrow, we shall know more. That night, as the wind howled around the inn and the sign creaked upon its chains, I lay wakeful, my thoughts chasing themselves in circles. Two men bound by a shared crime, each believing the other dead, and now both alive. One wounded, the other fled into the darkness. Somewhere in that tangle lay the truth, but it eluded me. Holmes, however, sat long into the night by the dying embers of the fire, his profile sharp against the glow, his eyes distant and intent. At last, he spoke softly, as though to himself. "Watson," he said, "there is a third man in this affair. I am sure of it." "A third man?" I echoed, startled. "Yes," he replied, rising slowly. "And if my deductions are correct, he has been nearer to us than we imagined. Before another day is out, we shall confront him face to face." He drew the curtains and looked once more toward the dark silhouette of Marston Lodge, standing lonely against the sky. "The ghosts of the past," he murmured, "are poor liars, Watson, but they leave excellent footprints." Morning found the inn wrapped in a thin veil of mist. The rain had ceased, yet the hedgerows glittered with moisture, and the air carried that faint chill which foretells the coming of frost. Holmes was already astir when I entered the sitting room. He stood by the hearth, his lean frame silhouetted against the glow, a telegram crumpled in his long fingers. "Mycroft has replied," he said, without preamble. "The War Office records tell a curious tale. Both men, Major Arthur Selby and Captain Charles Forsyth, served together in the Bengal Lancers. Both were reported missing in 1884 after an inquiry into misappropriated regimental funds. The investigation was closed when evidence suggested that Selby had fallen victim to foul play, and Forsyth had drowned in attempting to save him. In truth, neither was dead. Each vanished under the shadow of disgrace, and each, it seems, took the other's name thereafter. He handed me the paper. "You perceive the symmetry of the affair?" "Indeed," I said. "Selby returned to England as Forsyth, and Forsyth as Selby. But what drove them to such deception?" "Guilt or self-preservation," Holmes replied. "It remains to be seen which belonged to which. We must press our advantage while the trail is still warm." Selby, our patient from London, lay upstairs, feverish but conscious. Holmes questioned him gently, extracting fragments that I recorded with care. From his broken narrative, the story began to take shape. "There was a ledger," he murmured, his voice hoarse. A regimental account book that proved Forsyth had embezzled funds intended for native pensions. I found it. We quarrelled. I meant only to expose him, but he struck me down. When I awoke, I was alone. The tent aflame, the ledger gone. I fled, wounded, half mad. They said I was the thief. I took his name to survive. Holmes listened without interruption. And when you returned to England, I heard that Forsyth, calling himself Selby, was living here in Kent, a man of property, respected. I wrote to him, begged for restitution. He sent no answer. So I came to London, to you, Doctor. I meant no harm, only to unburden myself. But he found me. I saw him outside my window that very night. I fled here to confront him, and he shot me. His voice failed, and he turned away. Holmes regarded him with his usual composure. You are certain it was Forsyth who fired? I saw his face by the flash of the pistol, Selby whispered. There can be no doubt. Holmes made a brief note. Rest now, Major. The law will demand its reckoning soon enough. When we left the room, he turned to me with a grave expression. Watson, we must find Forsyth before the police do. There is something inconsistent in Selby's account. A man who has lived 10 years under a false name does not risk exposure by murder unless driven to extremity. I wish to see the ground for myself once more, by daylight. We returned to the marsh where we had discovered the blood and the ring. The tide had risen in the night, and much of the evidence was lost beneath the muddy water. Yet Holmes moved about with quiet precision, scanning each blade of grass, each disturbed clod. Suddenly, he stooped, uttering a sharp exclamation. A handkerchief, silk, monogrammed CF, and stained with blood. It was dropped in haste. The direction of the splash suggests that its owner fled from the marsh, not toward it. Then Forsyth was not drowned. Unlikely. If he were the pursuer, he may have escaped, perhaps wounded. But where would he go? His house was within sight, yet he did not return there. Holmes rose, gazing thoughtfully toward the distant chimneys of Marston Lodge. A desperate man seeks either refuge or revenge. Let us see which calls him. We approached the house cautiously. The door stood ajar. Within, all was silent. The drawing room bore traces of disorder. A fallen chair, ashes scattered across the hearth, a smashed decanter on the floor. Holmes examined the scene with methodical care. Observe, Watson. 2 glasses. One overturned, one half full. Someone visited Forsyth before he fled. The muddy prints near the door correspond to those of a man wearing heavy boots, the same as we followed last night. And here, upon the mantel, ashes from a foreign cigar. Forsyth smoked only cigarettes. Our third man has been here again. He crossed to the writing desk and found an envelope bearing no address. Inside was a sheet of notepaper upon which were written 4 words. Meet me, churchyard, midnight. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Excellent. The living hand of our mystery writer. Forsyth received this note yesterday, hence his agitation. The appointment was kept, violently so, yet the author of the note remains at large. He turned to me briskly. Watson, we shall return tonight. Until then, silence and discretion. I have no wish for the local constabulary to complicate matters prematurely. We left the house as we had found it. The day passed uneasily. Holmes spent the hours pacing our small sitting room at the inn, absorbed in thought, while I watched over the wounded Selby, who dozed fitfully. Once he awoke, calling Forsyth's name in delirium, I soothed him as best I could. At nightfall, we set out again, armed and muffled against the cold. The moon rose pale behind drifting clouds, casting an eerie light upon the gravestones. We reached the churchyard shortly before midnight and concealed ourselves among the yews. For nearly an hour, nothing stirred save the wind sighing through the branches. Then, from the direction of the lane, came the crunch of footsteps. A figure approached, tall, cloaked, moving with difficulty. It was Forsyth. He stopped beside the same grave where we had seen his double kneeling 2 nights before. For several moments he stood motionless, as though in silent prayer. Then another shadow detached itself from the darkness. A second man, shorter, with a revolver gleaming faintly in his hand. "Selby," cried Forsyth, his voice harsh. "So you have come after all." "Forsyth, thief, liar, murderer," the other answered. "You robbed me of honor and name. Tonight I take them back." "Put down that pistol," said Forsyth, his tone weary rather than afraid. "You have already shot me once." The man hesitated, lowering his weapon slightly. "Then it was you at the marsh?" "Yes," Forsyth replied quietly. "I went there to bury the ledger, the proof of my crime. But I found you instead. You fired before I could speak." The gun wavered in Selby's hand. "You expect me to believe that?" Holmes stepped forward, his revolver raised. "You had better, Major," he said calmly. "I have heard enough to hang 2 men, but perhaps to save one. Drop the weapon." Selby turned sharply, startled by our sudden appearance. In that instant, the pistol discharged, the shot ringing through the cold night. Forsyth staggered and fell without a cry. I rushed to him, but Holmes had already seized Selby's arm and wrenched the weapon away. "Watson!" he called sharply. "Is he alive?" I bent over the fallen man. "Barely. The ball has passed through the lung. Quick, help me lift him." We bore him to the vestry, where I dressed the wound as best I could. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked from Holmes to Selby, who stood trembling in silence. "Too late," Forsyth whispered. "But perhaps it is well. The ledger, hidden beneath the floorboards of my study, it will tell you everything. I took the money, but not the life. That crime belongs to another." His voice faded, and with it the last strength of his body. He lay still. Holmes covered his face gently with his handkerchief. "He is gone, Watson," he said softly. "The past has claimed its due." Selby sank to his knees, burying his face in his hands. "I meant only justice," he murmured brokenly. "Only justice." Holmes regarded him gravely. "And you shall have it, Major, but not of your own making. Come." He led the wretched man away as the church bell struck 1. The wind rose again over the marshes, and in its mournful sigh, I seemed to hear the echo of those doomed lives. 2 men bound forever by deceit and the shadow of the same sin. Holmes said little on the walk back to the inn, but as we entered the silent street, he spoke in a tone of quiet conviction. "Watson, before dawn breaks, we shall visit Marston Lodge once more, for I believe that within those floorboards lies not only a ledger, but the name of the true murderer." The first pallor of dawn was stealing over the sky when Holmes and I reached Marston Lodge once more. A thin mist drifted above the ground, and the house loomed out of it like some spectral vessel rising from a sea of smoke. No light showed at the windows. The air was heavy with that profound stillness which precedes sunrise, broken only by the caw of distant rooks. Holmes moved at once with his peculiar, noiseless energy. "Quickly, Watson," said he, "before the servants stir. We must recover the ledger before official hands disturb the scene. It is there that the final clue lies hidden." He produced from his pocket a small ring of tools, and in a few minutes had forced the lock upon the library door. The room lay just as we had seen it the previous afternoon, gloomy, shuttered, thick with dust. The faint smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Holmes lit a lamp and examined the floor with minute attention, tapping here and there with the handle of his stick. "Ah," he exclaimed softly after a few moments. "Do you observe this, Watson? The boards near the hearth have been recently disturbed, the nails replaced, yet not by a carpenter's hand." He knelt, inserted a thin blade between the planks, and with careful leverage raised a square of flooring. Beneath it lay a recess, perhaps a foot deep, and within that recess a small iron box. Holmes lifted it out, placed it upon the table, and broke the rusted clasp with a firm twist. Inside were several bundles of papers tied with ribbon, a handful of sovereigns, and a small, leather-bound ledger. Holmes opened the latter reverently, as one might open a coffin. "Here, Watson," said he, "is the record of our tale of greed and ruin." The entries were neat, military, unmistakably the work of a methodical mind. For several minutes, Holmes turned the pages, his eyes flickering rapidly over the faded ink. Then he uttered a short, satisfied sigh. "As I suspected. Observe these figures, withdrawals from regimental funds signed by both Forsyth and Selby. The falsification of these accounts required 2 men, not 1. They were partners in the embezzlement. When discovery threatened, Forsyth sought to cast the blame upon Selby. Selby, in turn, upon Forsyth. Each fled believing the other would fall. Hence their mutual fear and their exchanged identities. But," he paused, tapping the page with a long forefinger, "here is the crux of the matter. The handwriting in this final entry differs subtly from the rest. See the tremor of the pen, the slight distortion in the loops of the Y and G. This entry was forged, and I venture to say, not by either of the principals." I leaned closer, startled. "Then there was a third conspirator." "Precisely, and the initials beside the falsified entry, R.L., point directly to him." "R.L.?" I repeated, perplexed. Holmes closed the ledger with a snap. "Mrs. Lyle, Watson, the housekeeper." I stared at him in disbelief. "Holmes, surely—" "Consider," he interrupted quietly. Who knew Forsyth's habits? Who intercepted his letters? Who was alone in this house at all hours? Who, moreover, had access to the correspondence that summoned him to that fatal meeting? Mrs. Lyle has played the humble domestic, but she was formerly in service to the regiment in India. I recall now that the War Office mentioned a clerk's assistant, one Rebecca Lyle, dismissed for theft of supplies. She vanished shortly thereafter. But to what end? To secure her silence, Forsyth must have shared part of the stolen money. Years later, she discovered his assumed name, followed him here, and resumed her hold upon him. The missing funds, the ledger, all under her control. Yet when Selby returned, she saw exposure inevitable. The note that lured Forsyth to the churchyard bore her hand. She meant the rivals to destroy one another, leaving her free to escape with the remaining gold. The logic was flawless in its grim precision. I felt a chill admiration mingle with disgust. Then where is she now? Holmes's eyes gleamed. Gone, but not far. criminal of her cunning rarely flies without gathering her spoils. And this box, he tapped the empty compartment, is lighter than it should be. She took what coin she could, but the ledger she could not risk carrying until she was certain of our absence. We shall find her before she reaches the station. We hurried out into the mist. A cart track led from the rear of the estate toward the high road, and along it were the clear impressions of a small light carriage. Holmes followed them at a brisk pace, pausing now and again to test the wheel marks with his stick. Presently, from beyond the trees, came the distant clatter of hooves. "She has half an hour's start," said he, "but fortune, I think, is with us." We reached the crossroads as the sun rose, turning the mist to silver. There, halted by a broken trace, stood a hired pony cart. Beside it, struggling with the harness, was Mrs. Lyle herself, her plain gown half covered by a heavy cloak, a small chest at her feet. When she saw us, she gave a sharp cry and sprang back. "Stand aside, gentlemen," she said hoarsely. "I'll not be taken for their crimes." "On the contrary," said Holmes, advancing steadily, "you will be taken precisely for your own. The game is over, Mrs. Lyle. The ledger is found." Her eyes darted wildly from him to the road ahead. "You don't know what you meddle with. They ruined me. They both deserve to die." Holmes's voice softened. "That is as may be, but the gallows will not inquire into your reasons." With a sudden motion, she snatched something from her cloak, a small revolver gleaming dully in the pale light. Before I could move, Holmes's hand shot out like lightning. There was a flash, a sharp report, and the weapon spun harmlessly into the grass. "Enough," he said sternly. "You have courage, madam, but it has been misapplied. Come, you will return with us." She glared at him with loathing, yet the defiance ebbed from her face. "You think yourself clever, Mr. Holmes," she said bitterly. "But cleverness cannot change the past. Those men were thieves and cowards both. I only gave them what justice denied." Holmes bowed slightly. "Justice, madam, seldom wears the cloak of vengeance. Watson, be good enough to retrieve that pistol." When the local constable arrived, roused from the village by Holmes's telegram, he found his prisoner calm, almost serene. She surrendered without protest, though once, as she was led away, she turned back to us. "He would have lived in peace if you had not come," she said. "Peace founded on lies, Mrs. Lyle," Holmes replied gravely. "Such peace never endures." We returned to the inn exhausted. Selby still lay unconscious, hovering between life and death, but I believed that he would recover. Holmes, seated by the window, smoked in thoughtful silence. At length he spoke. "Watson, this case is a mirror in which human weakness is reflected thrice over: greed, guilt, and revenge. Each of them acted, each deceived, and each paid his price. Yet it was the smallest player who held the deadliest card." I nodded, too weary for words. Outside, the sun rose higher, burning away the mist and revealing the quiet countryside once more. The tragedy of Marston Lodge had reached its close, and with it ended the strange haunting that had begun in my consulting room days before. As we left Kent that afternoon, Holmes turned to me with that faint, sardonic smile which was his rare concession to emotion. "Watson," said he, "never forget that the ghosts of the past are best left buried, but when they rise, they seldom come alone." And so ended the affair of the patient from the past, a tale in which two men's sins had lain hidden beneath the ashes of years, until truth, relentless and cold as dawn, had drawn them once more into the light. We returned to London the following day under a cold, steady rain. The smoke of the city rose like a dark banner across the horizon, and the familiar rattle of cabs, the cries of the newsboys, and the dull roar of the streets greeted us with a strange comfort of routine. Holmes had scarcely spoken since leaving Kent. He sat opposite me in the train compartment, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half closed in deep thought. Only once did he rouse himself to remark that justice, however tardy, had again asserted its dominion. "Yet I cannot shake the feeling," he added almost to himself, "that the final page of this affair is not yet turned." When we reached Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson's astonishment at seeing Holmes alive was exceeded only by her delight. "Well, sir," she exclaimed, "if the dead can come walking into my rooms again, I shall never trust the newspapers more." Holmes merely smiled and waved her to silence. He had always preferred astonishment to praise. Within an hour he had changed into his old dressing gown and slippers and was seated before the fire, his violin across his knee. I thought the case at an end and was content to let silence reign when there came a tap at the door. Holmes glanced at me. "Watson, if I am not mistaken, that is Inspector Lestrade." And indeed, the door opened to reveal the familiar, small, wiry figure of our old acquaintance from Scotland Yard, his keen face beaming with satisfaction. "Evening, Mr. Holmes." "Doctor," he said briskly, shaking the rain from his hat. "Back in London, I see. I've just come from Kent. Thought I'd find you here." Holmes inclined his head. "You are quick, Lestrade. Have you news of our prisoner?" "Aye. The woman, Mrs. Lyle, was taken to Maidstone jail last night. Confessed the whole thing this morning, plain as day. Said she'd planned the double murder, forged the letters, and meant to take the money abroad. But there's a twist yet." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Indeed?" "She's dead," said Lestrade simply. "Dead?" I cried, rising in astonishment. The inspector nodded gravely. "Poison. A small vial found hidden in her sleeve. Cyanide. Took it while the constable's back was turned. Quick work. She never spoke again." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "So, the curtain falls," he murmured. "A fitting end for a woman of such resolution." Lestrade drew a packet of papers from his coat. "We found these on her person. A letter addressed to you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes took it and dismissed Lestrade with a nod of thanks. When the inspector had gone, he opened the letter carefully. The handwriting was firm, almost elegant. He read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, I know you will find me before I am far gone. You are too clever not to. But understand this. I was never the villain you suppose. Those men were both guilty. Each robbed, each lied, each left me to bear the shame. I was the least wicked of the three. The money you found was but a part of what they stole. There is more, hidden where only I can find it. Let the rest rot with me. It has paid for enough tears. Rebecca Lyle." Holmes folded the letter and cast it into the fire. "A strange justice," he said softly. "Her words are true enough. She was not guiltless, but she was no monster." I watched the paper curl and blacken in the flames. "And the money?" I asked. "Let the Treasury ferret it out if it can," he replied. "Such gold brings only misfortune. It is tainted with too many lies." For a while we sat in silence, the ticking of the clock the only sound. Then Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace the room. I could see the restless energy in every line of his figure. "Watson, there remains one question which I cannot dismiss," he said suddenly. "Who sent the original note that brought Forsyth, Selby, to your door? Not the woman. She had not yet learned his whereabouts. Someone else guided the beginning of this chain." "The man himself, perhaps," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. "No. The handwriting of that note was masculine, yet unfamiliar to me. It bore a military precision. There is, I fear, an unseen hand behind all this. Until I trace it, my curiosity will give me no peace." He turned to his desk and drew from a drawer the scraps of the torn letter I had recovered from the inn. With his magnifying lens, he examined them minutely, fitting the fragments together until the faint outline of a watermark became visible, a crown above the letters SRO. "The stationery room, Ordnance Department," he murmured. "Curious. That paper is supplied only to government offices. Why should a deserter from India be in correspondence with such a quarter?" "Surely," I said, "you do not suspect official involvement?" "Not involvement, knowledge," Holmes corrected. "Watson, there are corners of the empire where scandal and secrecy walk hand in hand. Selby and Forsyth were not the only ones who profited from those funds. There was a superior officer, a Colonel Adair, whose name was whispered in connection with the missing accounts. He was quietly pensioned off and has since lived in seclusion near Guildford. It may be coincidence, but coincidences are the foundation stones of truth. That same evening, at Holmes's insistence, we took the train to Guildford. The chill drizzle followed us, and the station lamps burned dim through the fog. Colonel Adair's residence proved to be a modest villa on the outskirts of the town, surrounded by unkempt gardens. Holmes sent in his card, and after some delay, we were admitted to a somber study lined with books. The colonel was a tall, spare man of 60, with an expression of habitual reserve and a limp that spoke of old service wounds. He greeted us politely, but without warmth. "I recall both Selby and Forsyth," he said, after Holmes had explained our errand. "A regrettable business, but I fail to see how it concerns me now." Holmes regarded him steadily. "It concerns you, Colonel, because a letter written on your departmental stationery summoned one of those men to his death." Adair's eyes flickered. "Impossible. No such letter was ever written." "Perhaps not by your hand," Holmes replied, "but certainly from your office. I have reason to believe that someone still in government employ wished to prevent those men from speaking. The ledger contained not merely accounts, but names of officers who shared in the theft. That is why Mrs. Lyle feared it would be found." The colonel rose stiffly. "You speak in riddles, Mr. Holmes. I have no further information to offer." "Then perhaps this will refresh your memory," said Holmes, producing the page of the ledger he had removed. "Note the entry marked RL, and beneath it, faintly erased, another set of initials. CA. Does that suggest nothing?" Adair's hand trembled. "Forgery!" he cried. "A clumsy forgery!" "Indeed," Holmes said coldly. "Then you will have no objection to my laying the matter before the authorities." For a long moment the colonel stood silent, his face ashen. At last he sank heavily into his chair. "You do not understand," he muttered. "It was not greed. It was necessity. The regiment was starving for supplies, the funds delayed by bureaucracy. I took what was needed, meant to replace it later. Forsyth and Selby learned of it, threatened exposure. I let them destroy one another, as they were bound to do. And when the woman appeared, I thought it best to let sleeping dogs lie. Holmes's voice was grave. You chose silence when truth was your duty. The Empire forgives much, Colonel, but not deceit. Adair covered his face with his hands. What will you do? Nothing. For now, Holmes said quietly. The guilty are dead or ruined. I seek only the truth, not vengeance. But let this be your warning. Secrets have long shadows, and they lengthen with time. We left him sitting motionless in the dim light. Outside, the fog had thickened, muffling the world in silence. Holmes turned up his collar and hailed a cab. The affair of the patient from the past is at last concluded, Watson, he said as we drove away. It began with a haunting and ends with a confession. Yet all along, the ghost was not of flesh, but of conscience. He leaned back, closing his eyes. There is nothing so persistent, my dear fellow, as a sin half forgotten. And with that solemn reflection, Sherlock Holmes lapsed into silence, while London's lamps glimmered faintly through the mist, like the eyes of watchful spectres guarding the secrets of men. The following week passed in relative quiet, though I could see that Holmes's mind still lingered over the events at Marston Lodge. There are cases, I have learned, that leave behind them a residue, an aftertaste of mystery which even success cannot dispel. The affair of the patient from the past was one such example. I would often find Holmes standing motionless by the window of our rooms at Baker Street, the smoke from his pipe curling about his head, his gaze distant and thoughtful. It was on the morning of the 7th day after our return that the first ripple disturbed that uneasy calm. I had gone down to breakfast when Mrs. Hudson entered with the morning post. Among the letters was one addressed in a delicate hand to Holmes. He slit the envelope absently, then paused as his eyes ran down the page. Curious, very curious, he murmured. What is it? I asked. He passed me the letter without a word. It bore no signature, merely the initials CA, and was written in a firm military script. Mr. Holmes, I write not to justify, but to warn. The truth you sought has not yet all been told. The dead woman's confession was incomplete. There remains one who profited by her silence and who now fears exposure. Be watchful. They have eyes in London. CA. Colonel Adair again, I exclaimed. Undoubtedly, said Holmes. A man tortured by conscience, but still unwilling to yield the whole truth. He knows that his complicity cannot remain hidden forever. And yet, they have eyes in London. Who are they, Watson? There lies our new puzzle. He crossed to his chemical bench, where a small pile of ash lay upon a tray. Before Lestrade departed, he left me these remnants taken from Mrs. Lyle's possessions, he continued. They were dismissed as the burnt scraps of old letters, but I suspected otherwise. Observe this portion. See the blue tinge of the flame residue. That, my dear Watson, is the unmistakable signature of Prussian paper, manufactured exclusively for diplomatic use. We are therefore dealing not merely with a domestic scandal, but with threads that lead abroad. I stared at him, amazed. You mean to suggest espionage? Holmes smiled thinly. I suggest nothing, yet. But recall that both Forsyth and Selby served in the Bengal Lancers. Their regiment was stationed near the frontier, where political intrigue was as common as dust. Suppose that among the missing funds were certain documents, maps, dispatches, lists of informants. Such items would fetch a handsome price in the right quarters. It is not impossible that our two officers were not thieves, but couriers of secrets. And Mrs. Lyle, a pawn who knew too much. He turned sharply as the doorbell rang below. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson appeared, flustered. "A gentleman to see you, sir," she announced. "Said his name is Mr. Harwood and that he comes on important business." "Show him up," said Holmes. The visitor proved to be a well-dressed man in middle life, with smooth manners and an expression of polished self-assurance. He bowed slightly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I am attached to the Foreign Office. My superiors have learned of your recent investigations in Kent and believe that certain papers may have come into your possession, papers whose contents touch the interests of the Crown." Holmes regarded him coolly. "And if they had?" "In that case," said the visitor, "I am instructed to request their immediate surrender." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Your credentials, if you please." The man produced a card, which Holmes examined with his lens. "A clever forgery," he said after a pause. "You will observe, Watson, that the royal cipher is reversed. Now, sir, perhaps you will tell us who you really are." For an instant, the visitor's composure faltered. Then he laughed quietly. "You are better informed than I supposed, Mr. Holmes. No matter. Since persuasion fails, necessity must serve." His hand darted beneath his coat, but Holmes was quicker. With a sudden motion, he struck the man's wrist, sending a small pistol clattering to the floor. Before our visitor could recover, Holmes had him by the collar and pinned against the wall. "Enough theatrics," said Holmes coldly. "Who sent you?" The man glared at him, breathing hard. "You will learn nothing from me." "Perhaps not," Holmes replied. "Watson, if you would be so kind as to fetch Lestrade, I believe Scotland Yard will have an interest in this gentleman's affairs." The prisoner's eyes flickered with alarm. "Wait, I will speak. I was, in the employ of a certain foreign embassy. The papers you recovered were thought to contain information of strategic value. My orders were to retrieve them at any cost. That is all I know." Holmes released him abruptly. "Then you may inform your superiors," he said, "that they have been chasing shadows. The documents in question exist no longer. They perished with Mrs. Lyle." The man hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Very well. You have won this round, Mr. Holmes. But take care. The game is larger than you think." He gathered his hat and departed without another word. For some minutes after his departure, Holmes stood motionless, his brows knit. "Larger than I think," he repeated softly. "That phrase, Watson, is the confession of a scoundrel who has spoken too much. There is indeed a game, one whose board extends far beyond Kent or London." He crossed to the mantel and took down his violin, playing a few bars of some dark, haunting melody. The sound hung in the air like mist over water. "You see, my dear Watson," he said at last, setting the instrument aside, "the ghosts of this case refuse to rest. Forsyth and Selby, the woman Lyle, even Adair, they were but the visible pieces. Behind them stands a mind, a calculating intelligence that used their guilt as cover for another design. This affair, which began in blood and deceit, may yet reach into the corridors of power." "And what shall you do?" I asked. "What I always do," he said simply. "Follow the scent until it ends." That evening, he dispatched several telegrams, one to Mycroft, another to a contact at the India office, and a third to Lestrade. Then, with his usual abruptness, he announced that he would spend the night at his laboratory in Woolwich, where he claimed to have certain experiments of pressing importance. He did not return until the following afternoon. When he entered, pale with fatigue, yet alight with that strange inward fire which only the pursuit of knowledge could kindle in him, I knew that he had reached some decisive conclusion. "Watson," said he, "our case has taken an unexpected turn. Mycroft confirms that Colonel Adair's letter of warning was intercepted en route to me. The messenger who delivered it yesterday was found murdered this morning near Charing Cross. His pockets had been rifled, yet nothing of value taken. Plainly, the assassins sought the contents of that letter and believed it to be still upon him." "Murdered," I exclaimed. "Then this plot continues." "Indeed," Holmes replied grimly. "We are dealing with forces that do not shrink from blood, but they have miscalculated. The paper that might have betrayed Adair, and perhaps others, lies safe in my possession." He opened his desk and drew out a folded sheet covered with figures and cryptic notes. "It is a cipher, Watson, a military code of a type long obsolete, yet I have nearly broken it. When I have done so, we shall see whether our patient from the past was, in truth, a victim, or the unwitting instrument of something far darker." He turned the paper in his hands, the lamplight glinting on his sharp features. "There are times, Watson," he said quietly, "when the living are less dangerous than the memories they leave behind. This is one of them." And as the fire burned low in the grate, I could not shake the conviction that our adventure, far from being concluded, had merely entered upon a deeper and more perilous stage. For 2 days after the mysterious letter and the murder of its bearer, Holmes shut himself away in his room, emerging only to request food or coffee, which he consumed with little notice. From within came the ceaseless scratch of his pen, and, at intervals, the faint hum of a melody played on the violin, an old habit of his when engaged upon intricate mental labor. I respected his silence, knowing that any intrusion would only delay the inevitable revelation that was to come. On the morning of the 3rd day, as I was about to leave for my practice, Holmes's voice called sharply from his room. "Watson, come in, if you please." I found him seated at his table, surrounded by papers covered with figures and symbols. His eyes were bright with triumph. "The cipher is broken," he said, holding up a page. "It is not a military code, as I first supposed, but a ledger disguised as correspondence. Observe, each number represents a letter, each column a line of communication. It details the movements of certain shipments between India and the continent during the years preceding the scandal of Selby and Forsyth." He pushed the decoded sheet toward me. The list of names and destinations meant little to my untrained eye, but Holmes's gaze burned with intensity as he traced one entry with his finger. "Here, Watson, the crucial link. Shipment 27B, Lahore, consignee, Adair, London, broker, H. Voss, Hamburg. You see, Adair was not merely a soldier covering an embezzlement. He was an intermediary in the sale of stolen military supplies, weapons and ammunition diverted from regimental stores. The proceeds were concealed under the guise of pension payments. Selby and Forsyth acted as his agents until greed and suspicion tore the conspiracy apart. I could only stare at him. Then the so-called missing funds were the least of it. The true crime was treason. When Selby discovered the full extent of Adair's dealings, he attempted to blackmail him. Forsyth, loyal perhaps from fear, intervened. The quarrel turned violent, and both men disappeared rather than face inquiry. Mrs. Lyle knew portions of the truth, and through her, the matter reached the ears of certain foreign agents. The letter we received was Adair's belated effort to save himself, but he was already entangled beyond escape. As he spoke, Holmes's lean fingers turned the paper in the light. The man, Harwood, who visited us, no ordinary spy, but one of Voss's emissaries. The German was the broker named in the ledger. He has long been suspected by Mycroft of trafficking in state secrets. It is a network, Watson, and the threads of that network still run through London. Even as he spoke, a knock sounded below. A moment later, Mrs. Hudson entered, flustered. "Inspector Lestrade, sir. Says it's urgent." Lestrade bustled in, his face grave. "Holmes, I've come straight from Guildford. Colonel Adair's been found dead in his study. Gunshot wound, revolver in his hand, door locked on the inside. The coroner says suicide, but I'm not so sure." Holmes's expression darkened. Of course not. The man was silenced. Silenced? Yes, by the same agency that murdered the messenger. Adair had outlived his usefulness. His death closes the account, or so they believe. He rose abruptly. "Watson, we go to Guildford at once. Lestrade, you will accompany us. There is no time to lose." The journey was a tense one. Holmes spoke little, his eyes fixed on the landscape flashing past the carriage window. When we reached the colonel's villa, the local constables admitted us readily. Holmes's reputation by then was authority enough. The study presented a grim scene. The body of Colonel Adair lay slumped over the desk, a revolver in his right hand, the muzzle still clotted with powder. Papers were scattered across the floor, the room thick with the odor of burnt cordite. Holmes examined the weapon first. "A Webley service revolver," he said. "Fired once. Note, however, the faint bruise on the left temple, not the work of recoil. He was struck down before the shot was fired." The murderer placed the pistol in his hand and locked the door from without with the aid of a simple string and key trick. He moved to the window where the latch was broken. "Entry gained here. See the footprint upon the sill, narrow with a deep instep. The mark of a continental boot, German manufacture. Our friend Harwood, or rather Voss, was here last night." Lestrade whistled softly. "You mean he followed the colonel and did for him?" Holmes nodded. "To erase the last witness. But the man has overreached himself. There is a trace he could not efface." He knelt by the hearth and stirred the ashes with his penknife. From the grey dust, he extracted a twisted scrap of metal, no larger than a coin. "A wax seal," he said quietly, bearing the crest of the Foreign Office. "This was taken from Adair's papers after his death. Our adversary means to use those documents, perhaps to blackmail the government itself." He turned to me. "Watson, we must reach London before nightfall. Every hour counts." We took the first train back, arriving just as the gaslights flickered on along the Strand. Holmes was more restless than I had ever seen him. He sent Lestrade to guard the approaches to Charing Cross and directed me to accompany him to a warehouse near the docks, whose address he had found among Adair's effects. It was a forbidding place, long, low, and windowless, its brick walls glistening with damp. A single light burned within. Holmes motioned me to silence and crept forward. Peering through a crack, we saw two men bending over a table strewn with papers and open chests of coin. One was our former visitor, Harwood. The other, a burly foreigner with a heavy moustache and a scar across his cheek. Voss himself, Holmes whispered, the spider in his web. At that instant, a sound betrayed us, the creak of a loose plank beneath my foot. Both men sprang up. Voss snatched a pistol from the table, but Holmes was through the door in a bound. A sharp cry, a scuffle, then the crash of overturned furniture. I rushed in to find Holmes grappling with the giant, while Harwood darted toward the open window. A single shot rang out from the darkness outside. Lestrade's voice shouting, "Stop, in the Queen's name!" And the spy fell, wounded in the shoulder. Within moments, the room was ours. Voss, seeing escape hopeless, sank heavily into a chair, his face pale but defiant. "So, Herr Holmes," he said in thickly accented English, "you are too clever, but cleverness will not save your empire." Holmes regarded him coldly. "Nor will crime sustain yours." He turned to Lestrade, who had entered with his men. "Take these two into custody. You will find in those chests evidence enough to end their trade. The cipher papers, the ledgers, the stolen seal, all are here." Voss's lips curled into a sneer. "You meddle in affairs beyond your understanding." "Perhaps," said Holmes quietly, "but I understand enough to know that the lives of 3 wretched souls in Kent were but stepping stones in your greater design. You sowed suspicion, used their guilt to cloak your theft of state secrets, and when they threatened exposure, you killed them or let them kill each other. It is an old pattern, Herr Voss, but it ends tonight." The spy said nothing more. He was led away, cursing softly in his own tongue. Back at Baker Street, as dawn lightened the windows, Holmes at last relaxed in his chair, the familiar air of abstraction softening his features. "So ends, Watson," he said, "the affair which began with your patient from the past. It led us from the shadows of a haunted conscience to the glare of international intrigue. Forsyth and Selby were not heroes, but they were pawns, men whose sins became tools in a greater hand. It is often thus. The gravest crimes of state grow from the smallest seeds of human weakness." He leaned back, eyes half closed, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. "Let us hope, for England's sake, that these ghosts are laid at last." And with that, the great detective fell silent, the first rays of morning glinting upon his violin, while outside the bells of St. Mary's tolled the hour of 6, a solemn requiem for the dead and the deceived. For several days after the capture of Voss, London hummed with rumours. The newspapers spoke cautiously of a foreign plot frustrated by the vigilance of the authorities, and Holmes's name, though never printed, was whispered in more than one corridor of Whitehall. He himself, as was his habit, took no notice of the attention. Once the machinery of justice was set in motion, he considered his task complete. But I had known Holmes too long not to recognize that the case had left its mark upon him. It was not triumph I read in his expression, but a grave preoccupation. He spent hours pacing before the fire, or sitting motionless with his chin upon his hands, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. On the 4th morning after Voss's arrest, I found him thus and ventured to break his reverie. "You are dissatisfied, Holmes." He started slightly. "Dissatisfied? No, my dear Watson, but perplexed. Voss has confessed to espionage and to the murders of Adair's courier and the unfortunate colonel himself. Yet there remains a missing piece, one man still unaccounted for." "You mean Harwood, his accomplice. Harwood was merely a messenger. I refer to another, the shadow that first set this whole affair in motion. Remember, Watson, the anonymous letter that brought your patient Selby to your door. Neither Voss nor Mrs. Lyle wrote it. It came from some other hand, one that knew every detail of the Indian scandal and foresaw how events would unfold. Who could possess such knowledge? I asked. That, Holmes replied, is precisely what I intend to discover. He took from a drawer the letter in question, now much faded and worn. Observe the handwriting, a firm but old-fashioned script, educated with the peculiar flourish of a penman trained before the 1860s. The paper, as I noted earlier, was of government manufacture, but the watermark predates the recent series used by the Foreign Office. In short, it was written by a man once connected with the service, now retired. You suspect Mycroft's world. Holmes smiled faintly. My brother's world touches all others, Watson, but even he is not omniscient. That afternoon we called at the War Office, where Mycroft Holmes received us with his usual air of languid omnipotence. His vast bulk seemed almost to overflow the armchair into which he had subsided. Yet his keen eyes missed nothing. "Well, Sherlock," he said, "you have caused quite a flutter. The Foreign Office is in hysterics, the Home Office is uneasy, and the Prime Minister himself asks whether you have any more German conspiracies tucked under your arm." Holmes bowed slightly. "Tell him I have only this." He laid the letter upon the desk. "Who wrote it?" Mycroft adjusted his spectacles. "Ah, the hand is familiar. Yes, I thought so. Colonel Sebastian Moran." I started. "Moran, the man who served Professor Moriarty?" "The same," said Mycroft. "After your brother's adventure at Reichenbach, he vanished from England, only to resurface in India. He has since trafficked in every species of intrigue. If this letter is his, then your case, my dear Sherlock, has the taint of that old serpent still about it." Holmes's face hardened. I feared as much. Voss was but the tool, Moran the master. "But Moran is dead," said Mycroft, "killed 2 years ago in Burma." "So it was reported," Holmes answered dryly. "But death, like exile, is a condition easily assumed by men of his profession. I believe Moran lives, and has now resumed his trade under another name." When we returned to Baker Street, Holmes at once sent telegrams to various agents. By evening, he had confirmation of his theory. A certain Captain Morland, recently arrived from Calcutta, had taken lodgings at the Albany under suspicious circumstances. His description matched Moran's precisely. "Watson," said Holmes, reaching for his hat, "the time has come to close the ledger of this case. Bring your revolver." The Albany stood hushed and stately as we climbed the stairs to the captain's rooms. Holmes's knock received no answer. With a deft twist of his lockpick, he opened the door and we stepped into a dimly lit sitting room. A single lamp burned low upon the table. Beside it, an open bottle of claret and 2 glasses. Papers lay strewn across the carpet, as though their owner had been interrupted. "Careful," Holmes whispered. He expected company, and not ours. Even as he spoke, the curtain at the far end of the room stirred. The shadow detached itself and moved swiftly toward the window. Holmes sprang forward, but the figure turned with a snarl, the glint of steel flashing in his hand. I heard the report of my revolver echo through the room, mingled with Holmes's cry. "Drop it, Moran!" The weapon fell to the floor. Moran, or Morland as he had styled himself, staggered, clutching his wounded arm. His hawk-like face, though pale with pain, retained its sinister calm. "So, Holmes," he said through his teeth, "you are not so dead as they said after all." "Nor you," Holmes retorted. "It seems we are both poor at dying." Lestrade, whom Holmes had prudently summoned beforehand, entered at that moment with 2 constables. Within minutes, the ex-colonel was secured. Holmes stood over him, his expression one of cold curiosity. "You are clever, Moran. Clever enough to foresee that Adair's death would silence suspicion and that the foreign agent Voss would bear the blame. But you misjudged 2 things: the persistence of my friend Watson and my own distaste for unfinished business." Moran laughed harshly. "You have won again, Holmes, but it will do you no good. The papers you seek are already beyond your reach." Holmes's eyes glittered. "You refer, I presume, to these?" He drew from his coat a small packet of documents bound in twine. "Taken from your desk while you were attempting to stab me. They will be returned to the government where they belong." For the first time, the great criminal's composure broke. His hand clenched convulsively, and he muttered a curse beneath his breath. When he had been led away, Holmes sank into a chair and lit his pipe. "It is strange, Watson," he said at last. "We pursue the crimes of nations and find at the core the same motives that drive the pettiest thief: greed, pride, and the hunger for power. Men like Moran merely magnify these impulses upon a grander stage." He leaned back, his gaze distant. "Do you recall our first encounter with him in the affair of the empty house? I thought then that his chapter was closed. Yet evil has a remarkable habit of resurrection, as persistent as the human vanity that breeds it." I nodded. "And now?" "Now," said Holmes, "the book is finished. The patient from the past, the haunting, the stolen gold, all were but preludes to this greater malady. We have at last traced the disease to its source. London may sleep more soundly tonight." He smiled faintly. "As for me, I think I shall allow myself the luxury of breakfast before the next summons to trouble arrives." And so it was that, as the dawn broke over Baker Street once more, the long, tangled mystery that had begun with a frightened man's confession in my consulting room came finally to its end. An end marked not by triumph or applause, but by that quiet satisfaction which was the only reward Sherlock Holmes ever desired. The peace that follows truth, and the knowledge that, for a brief time at least, the shadows had been driven back. The newspapers, those inevitable chroniclers of public half-truths, gave the affair a brief flourish and dismissed it under the heading of "An International Scandal Suppressed." A few discreet paragraphs hinted at diplomatic ramifications and official gratitude to unnamed parties. It was enough for the city. London moved on. It always does. But in the quiet of Baker Street, I saw that Holmes was not so easily diverted. For several weeks, he remained absorbed in documents connected with Moran's capture. When I ventured to suggest a well-earned rest, he merely smiled. "Rest, my dear Watson," said he, "is a condition of mind. Mine does not yet permit it." It was on a grey afternoon in February that the final thread of this tangled skein presented itself. I had returned from a consultation in Harley Street to find Holmes seated at the table, a telegram spread before him. His expression, though calm, bore that faint tension I had learned to associate with the scent of new danger. "Watson," said he, "our case refuses to die. Read this." The telegram was from Lestrade. It read, "Voss escaped from Newgate last night. Guard murdered. Believed to have accomplices still at large. Warned to expect movement toward continent. L." "Voss!" I exclaimed. "I thought the man securely in custody." "As did I," Holmes replied. "But rats find the smallest holes. This was no ordinary escape. A file smuggled into the cell, a drugged jailer, a rope lowered from the outer wall, each executed with military precision. Voss has powerful friends, and they mean to recover what he lost." "You refer to the stolen papers?" "Precisely. Moran's effects contained copies only. The originals are still missing. Voss will seek them, and perhaps vengeance as well." Holmes rose and began pacing the room, his long fingers clasped behind his back. "I have taken certain precautions. Mycroft has arranged for extra guards at the Foreign Office, and Lestrade has men watching every port. Yet I fear we have not heard the last of our adversary. He is a man of intellect, courage, and desperation, the most dangerous combination known to crime." As he spoke, a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a letter upon a tray. "Delivered by hand, sir. No return address." Holmes took it, examined the seal, and frowned. "Curious," he murmured. "The crest is foreign. Austrian, if I mistake not." He broke the seal and read aloud. "Mr. Holmes, you have meddled in affairs that do not concern you. The balance of nations is not altered by the fall of one spy. Withdraw your hand before it is crushed. This is your only warning. V." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "The courtesy of an enemy, Watson. He means what he says. We must act swiftly." He went to his desk, drew forth a map of London, and began marking it with pins. Voss cannot leave the city by conventional means. Every port is watched. Therefore, he will seek another path, perhaps through the river. There are smugglers' routes still used along the old wharves near Limehouse. We shall begin there. That night found us in the fog-bound labyrinth of the East End, moving cautiously among warehouses and narrow alleys that reeked of tar and brine. The river lapped sullenly against the piles. Lanterns glimmered through the mist like dying stars. Holmes, muffled in his Inverness cape, moved ahead with silent assurance. Presently, he stopped before a low brick building whose windows were shuttered and barred. A faint light filtered through the cracks. "There, Watson," he whispered. "Our quarry lies within. Listen." From inside came the murmur of voices. 3, perhaps 4 men speaking in German. Then the scrape of a chair, the creak of a door. Holmes pressed his eye to a gap in the boards. "Voss himself," he muttered. "And with him, a stranger, a tall man in naval uniform. They are preparing to depart." "What shall we do?" I whispered. "Wait for the signal." Moments later, a low whistle echoed from the river. The door opened and Voss stepped out, carrying a small iron chest. Holmes was upon him in an instant. "Stand where you are!" A shout, the flash of a pistol, and the night erupted in chaos. I saw Voss's companion draw his weapon. I fired, and the man fell. Voss turned, flinging the chest into the river, then lunged at Holmes with a knife. They grappled fiercely, their figures blurred by fog and shadow. Suddenly, there came a splash. The 2 men locked together, staggering over the quay. "Holmes!" I cried, rushing forward. But already Lestrade's men, who had followed at a distance, were upon the scene. One cast a line into the dark water. Another swung his lantern over the edge. For an instant, I saw the swirl of bubbles, then silence. We dragged the river for hours, but only one body was found, that of Voss. Holmes did not reappear. By dawn, the fog had lifted, revealing a pale, pitiless sky. I stood upon the quay, staring at the muddy current that had swallowed my friend. Lestrade laid a hand upon my shoulder. "He went down fighting, Doctor," he said softly. "There's no man in London would have done more." I could not speak. My mind was filled with the memory of Holmes's last glance, calm, resolute, unafraid. 3 days passed. The newspapers lamented the loss of the great detective. I wandered through the silent rooms of Baker Street, unable to believe that the keen mind which had solved 100 riddles was stilled forever. On the 4th morning, as I sat alone by the fire, a gentle tapping sounded upon the window. I turned, and there, to my utter astonishment, stood Sherlock Holmes himself, drenched but smiling, a length of rope coiled over his arm. "My dear Watson," he said, stepping lightly into the room, "you appear to have seen a ghost." I sprang to my feet. "Holmes! Alive!" "Very much so, though somewhat damp. It seems the Thames has a less deadly appetite than the Reichenbach." He threw off his cloak and laughed quietly. Voss, poor devil, was not so fortunate. He dragged me under, but I managed to free myself and reach a barge downstream, a most invigorating experience. I could only grip his hand in silence. Holmes poured himself a glass of brandy and sank into his chair with a sigh. "So ends the final act, Watson. Voss is dead, his accomplices scattered, and the iron chest lies at the bottom of the river. Let it remain there. Whatever secrets it contained, they are safer in the mud than in the hands of men." He leaned back, his eyes half closed. "I sometimes wonder, Watson, whether the pursuit of truth is not itself a kind of madness. Each case solved leads only to another, darker one beyond. But we are what we are, my friend, and the chase is our destiny." The fire crackled softly. Outside, the fog thickened once more, muffling the city's ceaseless murmur. Holmes stretched his long legs toward the hearth, a faint smile on his lips. "I think," he said at last, "that London may grant us a brief truce. Until the next shadow crosses our path, let us enjoy the illusion of peace." And thus ended, for the moment, the strange and perilous history of the patient from the past, that curious case in which ghosts of guilt and ambition rose from the empire's far frontiers to trouble the quiet heart of London, and in which the keenest mind of our age once more proved that reason, courage, and friendship could prevail even against the darkness of men's souls. The weeks following Holmes's miraculous return passed in comparative tranquility. Spring crept slowly into London, the mist lifted, and the city began to stir with its restless vitality. Yet in the quiet sanctuary of Baker Street, I could not shake the conviction that the shadows of our recent adventure still lingered. Holmes himself, though outwardly unchanged, bore a subtle restlessness in his manner, a tension that told me his mind was not entirely at peace. One morning in early April, as I sat reading by the window, he turned suddenly from his violin and said, "Watson, do you believe in coincidence?" The abruptness of the question startled me. "Insofar as one believes in the weather," I replied. "It happens often enough." "Yet you would agree that too many coincidences in sequence cease to be coincidence and become design?" "Certainly." He smiled faintly. "Then listen. During the last fortnight, 3 separate dispatches have appeared in obscure corners of the foreign press. Each reports the disappearance of a government courier, each disappearance occurring near a port city. Lisbon, Antwerp, and Marseille. In every instance, the courier was said to be carrying sealed documents of military importance, and in each case, the trail ends abruptly at the sea. You suspect a connection with the late Voss. I suspect a continuation, said Holmes. Voss was a lieutenant, not the general. Someone else directs these operations from the shadows, someone of greater reach and subtlety. You remember the letter that warned me to desist? It bore the Austrian crest, not the German. Voss may have been a pawn in a broader game. He took up a small cutting from his pile of clippings and handed it to me. It was from a Vienna paper and mentioned an Englishman of distinction, recently arrived and residing under the name of Mr. Felton. A meaningless item to most readers, Holmes said. But note the date, 2 days after Voss's death, and the description of Felton's wound, a scar upon the left wrist, as though from a recent burn. That, Watson, is no coincidence. Voss's associate, the man who fell by your shot in Limehouse, bore just such a wound. He survived, and now he resumes the work. I stared at him. Surely you do not intend. Indeed I do, Holmes interrupted. We leave for Vienna tonight. And so began the final chapter of that strange affair. We travelled under assumed names, Holmes as a professor of chemistry, myself as his assistant. The journey was long and uneventful, save that I noted in my companion an almost feverish concentration, as though his whole being were bent upon some inward calculation. Vienna in the spring was a city of elegance and intrigue. The cafes hummed with gossip. The very air seemed thick with secrets. Holmes wasted no time. By the 3rd day, he had traced the elusive Mr. Felton to a villa on the outskirts of the city, a quiet residence surrounded by gardens and high walls. From a discreet inquiry, he learned that Felton received few visitors, save one, a lady of striking appearance, said to be English. Mrs. Lyle's sister, perhaps, I suggested. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, there are no sisters in this play. I fear we deal with a more dangerous actress. That night, under cover of darkness, we approached the villa. Holmes had arranged through the local police to have the grounds discreetly watched, but he insisted upon personal reconnaissance. We slipped through a side gate and crossed a stretch of lawn toward the lighted windows of the study. Inside, 2 figures sat at a table, the man calling himself Felton, unmistakably the wounded agent from Limehouse, and opposite him, a woman veiled in black. Holmes touched my arm, and we crouched in the shadow of the shrubs. I must hear what they say, he whispered. Producing a small tube of his own invention, he directed it toward the open transom above the window. The device carried sound with remarkable clarity. The man's voice reached us first, harsh and low. You promised the papers, madam. I risked my life to recover them. The woman's tone was cool. And you shall have them, but not yet. The Englishman still lives. Holmes. Until he is removed, the documents remain where even you cannot touch them. A pause, then a muttered curse from the man. He will not rest until he finds us. Better to strike first. The woman laughed softly. You may try, but remember, our patron pays for success, not failure. Wait for my signal. Holmes's hand tightened on my sleeve. Do you recognize her voice, Watson? I listened, frowning. There was something familiar in its cadence, its deliberate precision. Surely not Mrs. Lyle. No, another who used her influence in the same circle. I suspected her from the beginning, though proof was lacking. The Countess von Ormstein, widow of the late ambassador, the very woman once involved in the scandal of the Bohemian photograph. An old adversary returned. I remembered well that earlier adventure, in which Holmes had matched wits with Irene Adler, then married to the Count von Ormstein. Could it be that the famous lady herself was entangled once more in matters of intrigue? Before I could speak, Holmes drew me back sharply. They are moving. The light within the study dimmed. We slipped around to the rear of the house, where Holmes found a partially open door. In an instant, we were inside. The hall was dark and silent, but from somewhere above came the faint creak of a stair. Holmes motioned me to follow. We ascended softly, step by step, until we reached the landing. There, the glow of a lamp revealed the figure of the Countess herself, standing before a mirror, the veil thrown back from her face. She was beautiful still, but her expression was hard, and the smile that played upon her lips as she examined a revolver in her hand was anything but gentle. Holmes stepped forward. "Good evening, Countess. Allow me to relieve you of that weapon." She turned swiftly, but he had already caught her wrist. For a moment she struggled, then laughed with that same low musical laugh I remembered. "Mr. Holmes, you are the most inconvenient man in Europe." "I shall take that as a compliment," said he, pocketing the revolver. "Your associate has fled, but the police will attend to him. As for you, the game is over." "Is it?" she asked. "You think I serve a nation? I serve myself. Those papers would have made me rich beyond reason. You should have joined me, not opposed me." "Tempting," Holmes replied, "but I have my own peculiar tastes. I prefer reason to profit." At that moment, a commotion arose below, the sound of voices, running feet, and the sharp command of an officer. Holmes stepped aside as two constables burst in. The Countess regarded him coolly. "You may have won, Mr. Holmes, but you will never be rid of me. The world is full of masks." She surrendered without protest, sweeping past us like a queen disdaining her captors. Back in our rooms that night, Holmes sat long in silence. At last he said, "She was right, Watson. The world is full of masks. Each crime I uncover reveals not one face, but many, each wearing its own semblance of virtue. It is the oldest pattern in existence. Men sin for power, women for freedom, and both call it necessity." He smiled faintly and reached for his pipe. "And so, the curtain falls upon the affair that began with your patient from the past. The ghosts have been laid, though I confess they have given us a lively chase." He struck a match, the flame lighting his keen profile. "You may set down, my dear friend, that Sherlock Holmes, having once more wrestled with the darkness, intends to sleep late tomorrow." I laughed, though my heart was full, for I knew that rest for him was but an interlude, that somewhere in the vast web of London's mysteries, another thread was already waiting to be drawn into his tireless hand. We remained in Vienna for several days, following the arrest of the Countess von Ormstein. The Austrian authorities were courteous but discreet, and it soon became clear that they preferred to let the scandal subside quietly rather than risk diplomatic embarrassment. Holmes, for his part, gave them no more information than was necessary. "When truth and statecraft meet," he remarked dryly, "the former is rarely invited to stay for supper." Our return journey to London was uneventful. I noted, however, that my friend grew increasingly introspective. He smoked incessantly, spoke little, and seemed to regard the passing landscape with eyes that looked inward rather than out. Only once did he rouse himself to observe that the affair had ended much as it began, with a single human emotion disguised beneath layers of deceit. "Ambition, Watson," said he, "is the one vice that can masquerade as every virtue. It builds empires and destroys them with equal indifference." It was nearly midnight when we reached Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson, ever faithful, had kept our rooms aired and a fire burning. I confess, I felt the old contentment as I hung my coat upon its familiar peg and saw Holmes's violin lying upon the table beside the Persian slipper. For all his wanderings, for all the storms that had whirled about us, this room had remained our anchor. The next morning brought the expected visit from Inspector Lestrade, who had followed events with great interest through his official channels. "So, it's all wrapped up at last, Mr. Holmes?" he asked cheerfully. Holmes glanced up from his newspaper. "As neatly as human frailty allows, Lestrade. You'll find that the Austrian police are keeping their own counsel on the Countess. I doubt her trial will see daylight." "Pity," said the inspector. "Would have made a fine story for the press." Holmes folded the paper and leaned back. "Indeed. But there are times, my dear Lestrade, when silence is the only form of justice. Let the lady vanish into history. She will not trouble us again." When Lestrade had gone, Holmes turned to me with a faint smile. "And now, Watson, you must be wondering whether we are truly finished with this business." I nodded. "I have learned that with you, Holmes, no case ever ends precisely when it should." He laughed softly. "Your intuition is as reliable as ever. Observe this." He handed me a thin envelope bearing the seal of the British Embassy in Vienna. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned, on which were written the words, "One piece still missing. Beware the hand that holds the pen." "What do you make of it, Watson?" I studied it, puzzled. "A warning, perhaps. A threat." "Possibly both," Holmes replied. "But the handwriting is not that of the Countess, nor of any of our known adversaries. There remains, it seems, a writer behind the writers, a mind content to let others act and fall while he observes. It is the same hand, I suspect, that first drew Selby to your consulting room." "You mean that even now the original instigator—" "Precisely. The spider still sits in the center of his web. Voss, Moran, Ormstein, all were but threads radiating outward. The question is, whose web was it? For the first time in many weeks, I saw in him that old spark of fierce delight, the thrill of the chase. Yet I felt an uneasiness I could not entirely conceal. "Surely, Holmes," I said, "you have earned your rest. Let this matter be. What harm can remain now that its instruments are destroyed?" He regarded me gravely. "My dear Watson, harm is a seed that waits for spring. You may bury it, but it will rise again. The hand that holds the pen, as our anonymous friend phrases it, is still at work." That evening, while I wrote my notes of the case, Holmes sat by the fire in deep contemplation. At length, he rose, crossed to the mantel, and took down a small portrait that had stood there since the early years of our association. The photograph of Irene Adler, the woman. as he had once called her. He studied it for a long time. You think she was involved? I ventured. No, said Holmes slowly. Not directly. But she taught me something no criminal or minister ever could. That intellect alone is not enough. The game is never purely logical, Watson. It is human. And where there is humanity, there is unpredictability. He replaced the picture gently and turned toward the window, where the fog drifted past like pale ghosts. We live in an age of masks, he said. Behind every smile, some motive hides. Behind every gesture, some design. The Countess, Voss, even poor Forsyth and Selby, they were all playing parts written for them by another hand. And who, then, is our playwright? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. When I know that, my friend, I shall perhaps retire. A week passed without further development. Holmes busied himself with minor consultations, though I knew his thoughts were elsewhere. Then, one evening, as I returned from my rounds, I found him standing at the window, a cablegram in his hand. It has come, Watson, he said. The final move. The message was brief, sent from Trieste. Felton escaped custody. Ship bound east. Destination unknown. Holmes read it aloud and dropped it upon the table. Our adversary retreats toward the Orient. There lies the refuge of all defeated conspiracies. But mark my words, he will rise again. The East is fertile soil for schemes that flourish in the dark. I watched him as he spoke, noting the quiet satisfaction in his tone. You mean to follow him? I asked. He shook his head. No. There are times when pursuit is futile. The sea itself will act as jailer. Let him vanish into the mists from which he came. Our duty ends where our reach fails. He poured himself a glass of claret and raised it toward the fire. To the dead, Watson, the guilty and the innocent alike. They have written their story in full. Let us hope the world reads it as a warning. I joined him silently. The firelight gleamed upon the glass and upon his lean, ascetic face, now softened by an expression I had rarely seen there, one almost of melancholy. Tell me, I said, will you ever rest, Holmes? Truly rest? He smiled, the faintest curve of the lips. Perhaps when the pen itself falls still. Until then, there will always be another line to read, another truth to uncover. You see, Watson, mystery is as endless as the heart of man. The clock on the mantel struck midnight. Outside, the city murmured in its sleep, and the rain began to fall softly against the window. In the glow of the fire, Sherlock Holmes sat motionless, his eyes half closed, the smoke of his pipe curling upward like a question mark written upon the air, an emblem, perhaps, of that eternal enigma which even his great mind could never wholly dispel. So ended, or seemed to end, the long saga that had begun with a trembling knock at my consulting room door. Yet even then, I knew, as all who knew Holmes must know, that no ending with him was ever absolute. Somewhere, in the quiet depths of that unfathomable brain, another mystery was already stirring, another thread of the vast web being drawn toward the hand that never rested. It was on a damp and misty morning in May that I received a note from Holmes. Short, urgent, and characteristic. Come at once, my dear Watson. The curtain has not yet fallen. H. I found him standing by the window of our sitting room, his face pale and intent, the familiar grey eyes bright with that cold fire which always heralded action. Upon the table lay a single newspaper, its columns marked in red pencil. Without a word, he handed it to me. The article was from the Times. A British vessel, the Calypso, bound for Bombay, was lost off the coast of Aden after a mysterious explosion aboard. Among the passengers was an Englishman travelling under the name of Mr. Felton. His body has not been recovered. I looked up in astonishment. Felton? The spy who escaped custody? Precisely, said Holmes, and now presumed dead. Yet mark the phrasing, Watson. A mysterious explosion. Not a boiler accident, not a storm, but an explosion. Someone ensured that the Calypso would never reach port. You think that our unseen adversary has erased the last witness. It is neat, efficient, and chillingly final. He moved to the fireplace and stood there, hands clasped behind his back. This affair has the flavor of something far greater than mere espionage. The destruction of a ship, the silencing of every tongue aboard. Such acts are not the work of vengeance, but of policy. And when policy murders, it leaves no fingerprints. I could not help but shiver. Then the case is truly at an end? Holmes gave a slow smile. End? My dear Watson, an end is merely the point at which one story yields to another. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with the Morning Post. Among the letters was one bearing a foreign stamp. India, by the look of it. Holmes slit it open and read in silence. As he did so, a curious expression passed over his face, a mingling of surprise and grim amusement. Read that, Watson, said he, tossing it across. The letter was written in a strong, familiar hand. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You will not find my body in the Arabian Sea. I have survived worse tides. The game continues, though the board has changed. I bear you no ill will, for you play fairly, which is more than I can say for your employers. Watch the east, Mr. Holmes. The sun rises there, and it casts long shadows. F. I lowered the paper slowly. Then he lives. Indeed, said Holmes quietly. And he warns us, though whether from arrogance or courtesy, I cannot yet decide. There is something almost chivalrous about our adversary, an enemy who prefers correspondence to concealment. He sat down, filling his pipe with methodical calm. The East, Watson, the sun and its shadows. Our empire's far frontiers breed more than heat and malaria. They breed ideas and men who serve them. This Felton, or whatever name he now assumes, is not merely a spy. He is the herald of a new species of crime, international, invisible, and implacable. I watched the smoke curl upward as he spoke, and for the first time I saw something in Holmes's expression that I had rarely glimpsed before. Unease. You fear him? I asked. I fear nothing that breathes, he said quietly. But I respect intellect, and I recognize mine when it confronts me from another mind. This man has eluded death twice, erased every trace of his identity, and turned the world itself into his hiding place. If he lives, he will strike again. He rose suddenly, went to the cabinet, and drew out a bundle of papers bound with string. These are the surviving fragments of the Forsyth-Selby affair, the beginning of our labyrinth. The ledger, the letters, the ciphered lists, all trace back to the same source. I had thought the chain complete, but this letter proves otherwise. There is another link still waiting in the dark. What will you do? For the moment, nothing. A man who hides will reveal himself soon enough if you give him silence in which to listen for his own echo. He placed the packet back into the cabinet, locked it, and pocketed the key. Then he turned to me with a lighter air. Come, Watson, I believe a visit to Simpson's for luncheon will serve us better than brooding upon absences. There is more nourishment in roast beef than in speculation. I laughed in spite of myself, though the unease lingered. We lunched together as of old, and by the time we returned to Baker Street, the mood of foreboding had almost passed. Holmes whistled softly as he arranged his chemicals, and I set about my medical correspondence. But later that evening, as the fog rolled in from the river and the lamps glowed dimly through the mist, I found Holmes still at his desk, the unopened letter from India beside him. He was staring into the fire, his face grave. "Watson," he said at last, "have you ever considered how narrow is the line between justice and vengeance?" I looked up, startled by the intensity of his tone. "I have never confused them." "Nor I hope," he said. "Yet I confess, this Felton awakens in me something perilously akin to pursuit for its own sake. The man fascinates me. He is an artist of crime, not a brute. Were we to meet under other circumstances, I might even admire him." He fell silent again, and I thought it best to let him be. The clock ticked steadily. The fire sank lower. At length, Holmes rose and drew the curtains, shutting out the fog. "I think," he said, "we have earned our rest. The world will spin a little while without us." The following morning, I left early for my practice. When I returned that evening, I found a note pinned to the mantel in Holmes's hand. "Gone to Dover. A matter of some interest has arisen. Do not be alarmed if I am absent for several days. H. G." That was all. No clue, no explanation, only the familiar brevity that heralded a new adventure. I sighed and folded the note into my pocket. For a moment, I stood by the window, watching the ceaseless bustle of London, the cabs and omnibuses moving like restless thoughts through the fog. Somewhere among them, I knew, my friend was already at work, following another thread through the endless web of human intrigue. And thus, though the affair of the patient from the past had run its course, its echoes continued, fading, perhaps, but never wholly silent. For in the heart of Sherlock Holmes there lived that unquenchable hunger which no victory could satisfy, the desire to know, to seek, to stand face to face with the unknown and wrest from it the smallest fragment of truth. So long as such mysteries endured, I knew he would never rest. And I, his companion and chronicler, would be there to follow wherever his restless intellect might lead, through the fog of London, across oceans, or into the very depths of the human soul. The fire crackled softly, and I imagined his voice once more beside me, calm and certain. The game, Watson, is never truly over. It merely waits for its next move.